Okay. Wow, I didn't know that. Where's Sharon? Oh, I didn't know that.
It's next week, not this week.
Oh.
זה שבוע הבא?
Okay.
סליחה.
Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to start, and then while we're waiting for the source sheets, I'll start with the intro, and then we'll get to as soon as they bring the source sheets, I'll bombard you with all the sources and the pictures that you're going to have to look at today. Okay. So I'm going to give you, there is a definition. Okay, so this week's entire week of classes are dedicated in memory of Fanya Heller, Zichronah Livracha, beloved friend and guiding light of Matan. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little warning. Today we're going to be getting into, it's going to be probably one of the only days where we're really going to be getting into the boring nitty-gritty details of the architecture and the furnishings and what the Mikdash itself looked like. I think when people hear the word temple, of course on temple, most people think it's going to be the boring nitty-gritty of Vayikra, and so they don't sign up. So today is the only day we are going to be doing boring nitty-gritty stuff, but we have to because it's really, as we're going to see, and this is what we talked about last class, is understanding some of the details and the furnishings and what the experience was for people when they walked into the Mikdash is really going to be what helps us understand what the Mikdash was and how and sort of what place it took up in the imagination and in the daily lives of ancient Israel. One thing very quickly, just also at the outset, I was asked at the end of last class, actually both here and Renata, they're making a new way of functioning, is we're going to hold questions till as much as possible till the end of the class, because people on the Zoom can't hear the questions and they feel interrupted, and we're trying our best. It's a learning curve, but we're going to try our best to sort of balance keeping the people at home happy, keeping the people here happy. I think everyone's going to have to make a tiny bit of adjustments, but we'll all be good. Okay, so one of the things that we started talking about last class, if you remember, I gave the example with, I think with like a superhero, right? I said, if you see a man in tights and a cape and a logo on his chest, so we said there's a whole list of things we know about that person just based on the culture that we inhabit, right? We talked about all those lists of things that we can assume about a superhero if someone just shows us a picture of a superhero. And I sort of, by way of introduction, talked about the way in which that's the case for so many of the things that existed in the context of Mikdash that are completely lost on us. And material culture, really, I'm going to give another example today beyond the superhero, something more in terms of, sort of architecture and furnishings. Material culture is something that I think consciously and unconsciously, right? Some of them are not always conscious, incorporate values and social standards that in a way sort of guide modes of behavior within that given structure. And again, a structure could be something as small as a house or as large as a city. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. You walk in, and again, it's sort of a banal example, but once you start to realize how much of our culture is informed by the material surroundings, we'll begin to sort of even understand what temple was. Okay, so you have two restaurants. I'm going to describe two restaurants to you. One, you walk in and there are these sort of vinyl benches for seating and a big dais where people can take their own food and plop it onto their plate, and everyone's trying to get their money's worth with the all you can eat. And kids are there and they're spilling soda, and you're essentially serving yourselves, and there's paper, paper cups and maybe cutlery or maybe not, right? And the bright lighting and bold colors. That's one restaurant. Okay, and then there's another restaurant where the lighting is dim and the people that are serving you are wearing nicer clothing and there's soft music playing in the background and the furniture is all beautiful. Okay, now no one has to say to anyone sitting in the room, listen, it's safe to bring your kids to the first restaurant, but like don't take them into the second, right? No one has to say that to you. No one has to say, make sure when you're in the second place, make sure you use your fork and knife, don't grab the French fries and stuff in your mouth, because there are certain things, certain behaviors that we intuitively understand based on the culture that we inhabit, okay? And one of the things, and again, the rules that exist in one building don't exist in the other, and vice versa, right? And they don't have to be spoken and they don't have to be articulated explicitly. It's something that anyone in this room growing up, either in this country or any Western country, let's say, knows. Okay, now, one of the things that's very, very interesting is that we, again, unconsciously interpret messages communicated by space. There are certain buildings you walk in, say in a museum, for example. Intuitively, we understand you walk into a museum, you whisper, right? And if kids are running and screaming, so you tell them to be quiet, even though, why do they have to be quiet? People are standing and looking at paintings or sculptures, but there are certain behaviors that are communicated by the physical space around us. Right? And by the way, it's not always exactly the same across cultures. If you go to another country where sitting on the floor, right, around a cushion table on the floor and actually eating with your hands is the way people eat. So that would be a fine way of behaving, even though in the fancier restaurant here, that would not be considered acceptable. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to be sort of keeping an eye on is interpreting the messages and the meanings of constructed space. Okay? And in order to do that, what we need, or what it requires, which we spoke about last week, is an intimate knowledge of culture. Okay. And at the end of the day, it's all about reading the cues. I'll give you one other example, right, where cues are so culturally contingent. So today, if I live in Tel Aviv, or if I have an apartment in Manhattan that's all minimalist and clean, and there's very sharp lines, clean, bold, right, black and white colors. So to me, minimalist is the ideal, right, style. And if I see this Gothic cathedral, it's going to look so heavy and daunting, right? But if I compare Gothic, and I do not know enough about Ellen, you'll correct me if I'm wrong about this, okay? But from what I remember from art history back in who knows when. So if you compare the Gothic, right, architectural design to, for example, the Romanesque, which was heavier and shorter, so you'll appreciate that the Gothic architecture was actually meant to look more light and airy and higher up, and it's sort of, the metaphor of the Christian soul, Catholic soul, sort of, going up to heaven. But we can only appreciate that if we grew up with Romanesque architecture or we study it. Okay, so all of these things, and again, I'm giving all these examples because I think, in some ways we talk about temple and we imagine that it's so central to our lives. We daven on Shalosh Regalim, Hashem should restore the Beit HaMikdash and he should give us back the Avodah. And we look at Har HaBayit and we say, one day the Beit HaMikdash is going to be here. But I think we're so far removed from the culture that produced temples that we almost don't even know what we're davening for, right? We don't know what we're asking for. Now, that's not a bad thing, but it's just almost less authentic or less perhaps meaningful and deep than our tefillot and our aspirations and everything else associated with temple can be if we actually understand what the Mikdash was. And that's why today we have to go through a little bit of the sort of nitty-gritty of the physical makeup and what it might have represented. Now, when we talk about studying the concept of sacred space, okay, so sacred space is different, let's say, for example, than the restaurant, because the restaurant, we're really just studying it on the superficial level, right? What are the colors? What do the people look like? How are people speaking? All of that is relatively superficial, so to speak, right? Even what area of town does the restaurant appear? Okay, that's something that's important. So when we talk about sacred space, there's actually more levels to the discussion. Okay, the first level is the geographical space. So geographical space, what would you imagine geographical space is? You don't have to raise your hands, just throw it. Yeah. Okay, so right, but I'm saying take a step back. What questions would the study of sacred space in terms of geography, what would it look at? So you're saying, right, if I'll paraphrase, not just higher up, but where is the temple situated? Is it high up on a mountain where we look up to it? Is it low down in the valley? I remember when, right, if you go to Eastern Europe, one of the things that they show you on all those heritage trips is how the church always had to be the highest building in any given town. So the shuls always had to be lower than whatever size the church was. It was always relative. Okay, so geographical space is concerned primarily with topography, right? Is it up on a mountain? Is it lower down? Is it near a river? And its physical environment. What's it surrounded by? Is it surrounded by a busy town? Right? If you go to, I just heard Pachanka is closing, okay? But if you go to Pachanka and it's surrounded by these gorgeous views and the mountaintops, that's very different than walking out of a restaurant and hearing buses screeching and garbage trucks honking at each other, right? So the topography is important, the physical environment, the location of the building, the chambers, where things were situated inside, and the geographical space. The geographical space focuses primarily on the sort of interplay between the human and the geography, right? What we might call sort of the landscape, right? What you see when you look out at that space, right? So when people in ancient Jerusalem looked up at the hill, what did it mean to them? What impact did it have on them? How did the priests move through the building? Why was it on this axis as opposed to this? All of that is the first level of questioning. The next question is thematic space. So what would you guess thematic from theme? What's thematic space? What would you guess we're asking in the questions when we're asking thematic space? Okay, so excellent, right? It's significance, meaning what? So not,
Purpose.
Purpose, good. What else? Yeah.
Just as an example, I was thinking of like Holocaust museums sometimes, and how they do the windows to convey whether light's coming in.
Okay, excellent, right? So museums is actually such a great metaphor because museums, it's part of it is having sort of this educational experience. So they're trying to create they're trying to create the environment, they're trying to create the ambiance. So we're going to ask about, right, sort of symbolism. What else? Were you going to say something? Oh, okay. So we're going to ask, right, if, for example, in the Nevi'im, we talk about God's dwelling place as being on the hill, right? And we're going to talk about that later on. So the question is, what emotional impact do all of these different things have on the human psyche? What did it mean for the altar to be standing there? We're going to see today there were two huge pillars at the entrance to the Mikdash. What did those pillars evoke in the person? Right? Yeah.
Does the thematic refer?
Oh, I was supposed to not take questions. Okay, yeah.
Does it include the inside space?
Yes.
The outside?
The thematic, yes. So the question was whether the thematic, first of all, it includes the outside, the inside, the placement, the location, everything. And I'm presenting these as three separate questions, but it goes without saying there's overlap between them, right? Because theme and geography are going to be interconnected. The assumptions we hold about a cosmic mountain, which we're going to talk about in a few weeks, is going to be connected to the topography. Right, but there's fluidity between the questions, but what we're asking specifically is why was it made out of this material in particular? Why is that important? What do the rituals mean? Okay, and what do they achieve? That's thematic space. Yeah, I'm gonna be rude and say last question, and then I'll take just because they've made like
Trying to create a sense of awe.
Oh, sorry, it was a comment then for sure. Comment away. Yes. Okay. No, please. I'm just. No, please. Okay, creating a sense of awe, and we're going to see what that word actually means today, right? Because we use the word awe all the time. I'm like, oh my gosh, I was in awe. We throw it out oftentimes. We're going to see that awe of God in the ancient world is almost something, I hate to say it, that we're almost out of touch with now, in a way, I think, perhaps. And perhaps it's due to the fact that we're less ritualistic in this sort of God, this is God's home, right? We say Hashem is everywhere. I could close my eyes and concentrate and I dive into Hashem. And so do I have that level of awe that the temple engendered? I'm not convinced. Well, let me just do the last one is mythic space. Okay. So mythic space, it's also less sort of accessible matters. Right? Some that may have even been experienced subliminally or unconsciously by people. So, and it's connected to the mythology that was spoken of in the ancient world. So for example, the notion of the axis mundi, that there's a point in the world from which, right, on the physical earth from which the world was created, and everything else stems from there. So if the temple is believed to be built on this actual place from where the world was created, and by the way, the axis mundi was incorporated into Midrashic conceptions. We're going to get to that, okay? So then it has that idea. If it's sitting atop, right, this sort of great watery Tehom, which we also see in some of the famous Midrashim that we're going to look at in a couple of weeks. So then it's sort of, you see it as the center of the world and you experience it differently. And what the questions really for mythic space is not just how do the rituals work, right? But why, how do they achieve what they achieve, right? Why are we cutting the animal this way? And how is it going to do what I want it to do? Okay, now again, there's fluidity and there's overlap, it goes without saying, but these are the questions that essentially we're going to be looking at. Yes, sorry.
I just wanted to add, you said that today we think of creating space that's accessible more than, so like a shul would look to.
Okay, excellent. So hold that. We're mentioning here that there's a sense nowadays we want things to be accessible. We want religion to be accessible. Hold that, because towards the very end of the semester, the watershed moment in Jewish history is going to be when we lose the temple and we don't have ritual or Yom Kippur or Korban Pesach, anything, and Chazal have to fill that void and make religion meaningful in the absence of that, right? And they're going to have to make it accessible and portable and all. So accessibility is such an important word, and we're going to hold that off till the end. But what I want everyone to get back into the headspace of right now, which is exactly what you were saying, which we're going to be talking about in the next couple of weeks, which is the concept of inaccessibility, right? The fact that I cannot go in there, the fact that I have no idea what the Kodesh Kodashim looks like, creates a sense, like you were saying, of this awe, right? Of the unknown, of the mysterious, right? There's all of that package, which is, again, like you're mentioning, so different from the modern Jewish experience. Okay, so the challenge, and we talked about this last week, is that all of the symbolism from the ancient world essentially is lost on us, just like in 5,000 years from now, no one will know what a superhero is, and archaeologists are going to have to sort of dig up all the Marvel comics and try to piece together, and they're going to bring in source sheets with Marvel comic excerpts and try to explain that there's this thing called a superhero. That's what we're doing. We're digging through the archaeological, the literary, and the, again, literary evidence in Tanakh as well, to try to piece together. And what we're going to hopefully come to by the end of the class is a very, very basic sense, even though probably so much is still lost, okay? But as much as we can, try to understand what things may have looked like then. Now, just by way of example, to get you into the sense of how similar our temples were to the ancient Near Eastern temples. So just look on those first two things, actually, I want to read. Look on the first, on the source sheets. Oh, okay. There was another Hakdasha on the top of these sources I just saw. Okay, if you don't mind, I'm going to interrupt because this is important. The classes are also dedicated in memory of Moshe ben Rabbanit Malka and Harav Aaron Bina. They should be blessed with long and healthy life, who passed away on Rosh Hashanah, on Hoshana Rabbah 5782. Okay, so that was the second Hakdasha for this class that I didn't see. Okay. A couple of things. First of all, I want to read you a great quote that is nothing, it was not a book about temple in particular, but it's about this concept of material culture more broadly. And it says as follows: material culture, this is the first source on those source sheets, is the array of artifacts and cultural landscapes that people create according to traditional patterns and often tacit concepts of value and utility that have been developed over time through use and experimentation. These artifacts and landscapes objectively represent a group's subjective vision of custom and order. Okay, which is really, and again, the more I think you travel throughout the world and you see other cultures, the more you realize how what we assume about, like they're saying here, custom and order is not a given anywhere else in the world. Okay, now on the chart there, I brought just, again, this is from sort of different portions of this book by Clifford, sort of, different ideas that he mentions that I just organized into a chart for you, just so even superficially you could see how the language overlaps, the images overlap, right? We have to remember Hebrew is an ancient Semitic language. So there are going to be cognates in other languages that have the same words. We have anan and they'll have anan, and we'll have el and el. So here we have and I brought from the Mishkan, for example. Okay, so we know that Hashem dwells in the Mishkan. Mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Very, very clear. The ancient Near Eastern temples, I brought the Ugarit, but we'll read below. It says, to gods, to their tents, the circle of El, to their tabernacles. Right, so there too, it talks about the gods entering their tabernacles, just like after Chanukata Mishkan, Hashem enters our tabernacle, and then the Anan covers it. And there was a sense that the God entered. Okay, now it's interesting, the Anan of Hashem, I'm going to start with the ancient Near Eastern portion of the column. The Anan there in Ugarit, it's Anan, okay, is the messenger of the gods, the divinized cloud in their entourage. Okay, what's interesting about our Anan? What is the Anan, if you think back to Sefer Shemot, right? After Kriyat Yam Suf, what does our Anan do?
It was a protection and a guide.
Okay, so it was a guide, I'll use that word, right? Meaning when the Anan was there, we knew, right? Hashem was, and it was Anan during the day, Amud Eish at night, right? Amud Anan and then Eish. And essentially what the Tanakh makes clear is that it's there to symbolize that God is in our midst. So when it's moving, we move, and when it stops, we stop. But we didn't think the God himself was in that Anan. And that's going to be a really subtle but important difference that we're going to talk about again in a couple of weeks when we talk about the notion of an aniconic religion. We can't have symbols, and yet Hashem is always appearing in symbols. Hashem appears in a burning bush. Hashem appears in a cloud. Hashem. So what does that mean? Hashem appears there. Okay, but they too had an Anan, which is probably why when we're walking in the desert and all of the ancient world conceives of gods appearing in Anans, Hashem's symbol to us that he was there was a cloud and not a bunny rabbit, right? He could have also had a bunny rabbit walking in front, and when the rabbit stops, we stop, and when the rabbit hops, we hop, right? But it sounds silly, but again, the Anan that we take as a given, Anan Hashem, is because that's how ancients conceived of God's presence. Okay. The Chatzer, the part is the court of the Mishkan, and the Chatzer is also part of Baal's house. And again, he's bringing these from all of the extant ancient Near Eastern literature that describes temples. The Mishkan is to be built by the divinely commissioned and gifted craftsmen, right? There's a whole big thing made about Betzalel, and he was inspired by Hashem. He was able to do these things. The temple of Baal is made by the craftsman god Koshar Wachashish, which is interesting because there, who needs to build the temple? A demigod, right? And we have a human being inspired by Hashem, which, by the way, I'm not getting into it now, but if you go back to the beginning of Breshit, one of the things that's interesting, look towards the end after humanity is created, right? So Hashem creates, and then Cain and Hevel kill, Cain kills Hevel, et cetera, and the humanity proliferates. And then what we have is we watch the descendants are human beings creating string instruments and percussion instruments and farming tools and all these different sort of science and technology that the Torah says we created. Because in the Torah, we are created b'tselem Elokim, so we can be created. If you look at the ancient Near Eastern parallel creation myths, demigods, the gods had to come down and tell humanity the secrets of fire and mathematics and all these other things. Okay, so again, similar framework, but the nuances are very, very different. The Torah firmly believes that humanity is creative because we're creative. We don't need God the gods to reveal the secrets of things. That's part of Milua Ta'aretz V'Kif Shuha, right? That's us to be creative. Okay, that was a total tangent. Sorry about that. All right, last one. And if anyone goes onto YouTube, type in pomegranate priest skirt something, and you'll hear on YouTube there's a jingling they found in the digs that they're doing right by the Beit HaMikdash, right by the Temple Mount. They found a tiny little pomegranate bell that, for all intents and purposes, could very well have fallen off of the robe of the Kohen Gadol, because last thing on the chart, the skirts of the Kohanim are said to have golden bells and pomegranates suspended from the edge. Right? We know this from Shemot and also Vayikra. And then in Ras Shamra, a circular pedestal of bronze has been found, under the rim of which were decorations shaped like pomegranates, suspended like the ones on the garments of the Kohanim. Okay, so again, we love to imagine that our Mikdash is the only one in the world that ever looked that way. Ancient temples looked this way. The question is, what is monotheism communicating that veers off of pagan religions? And that's what we're going to be building in this course as we get to it. Okay, so let's start. If I asked you the best source, not Vayikra, not Shemot and Vayikra, because that describes the Mishkan, not the temple. Where else, if I wanted to get a sense of the grandeur of the biggest, most beautiful, well, not the biggest or most beautiful, but in its day, one of the most beautiful temples, where would I go? Where would I look? Shlomo HaMelech. Okay, so everyone open up to Melachim Aleph. And we're going to see, who gave me this Tanakh? You could read the letters in here?
Sorry.
Oh my God. No, I'm getting old. They said in the next year or two, I'm going to need now you're making me feel so old. Okay, here we go. We're going to go to Melachim Aleph, Perek Vav. We're going to start there. Okay. And we're going to see that I'm not going to be reading through every single detail in these prakim, but prakim Vav and Zayin essentially describe some of the features. You know, I'm going to grab my phone if you don't mind. Okay, are going to describe some of the features that we're going to be looking at. And we're going to see, I'm going to stop at some of the things that I think are just sort of important for us to look at, and some things also that have interesting parallels from the ancient world that are worth considering. Okay, so let's start with the very, very beginning. Now, before we even go into the text, actually, I apologize, open up to this beautiful picture, which by the way is also microscopic. There you go. That's the theme of the day. You cannot see one word on here, right? Or am I going blind? You can't see, right? I have to, it's my age. But you can't see the words on here, right? Not helpful. Okay. No, on this one, on the back, the last one, there's a picture of the Mikdash. It's not perfect. Oh, it's a separate page. Okay. So if you do not have one, there are more up here. Hold on. Okay. All right. On this beautiful page, what we have are some of the main features that I just want to talk about. Okay. So hold it handy if you want to even rip it off from the other sources and just have it handy because I'm going to keep referring back to it. But basically what you see here, this area is the Chatzer, okay, which is the outer area where all the people can come. Is there not enough?
It's not part of this.
They're coming around. Okay. Okay.
But there are more?
There are. Okay. See, all the people on Zoom are sitting pretty, just clicking on the link like that. Okay. Here we have the Chatzer. Okay, the outer courtyard where everyone is allowed access. Inside here is the Kodesh, if you can see what I'm pointing to. And then a little bit behind there, you would not have actually seen in. This is just cut down the middle, okay, to show you the inside. Further in is the Kodesh Kodashim, which we're actually going to spend in a class discussing the Kodesh Kodashim and the Aron itself. Okay, now the temple was on an eastern end. So the main sort of axis, it ran east to west. Okay, now everyone open up inside to Parak Vav for 1 second. And I'm going to start reading just, again, I'm not going to read all of it, but just so we have a sense of what's going on. Pasuk Aleph says, "Vayhi b'shmonim shana ve'arba'a me'ot shana letzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, b'shana revi'it b'chodesh zo hu hachodesh hasheni l'mloch Shlomo al Yisrael, vayiven habayit la Hashem." Okay, so Shlomo wants to build this house. We're not going to get into the measurements. Right? Etc. Okay, what we're seeing here, and again, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty. I want to try to stay away from measurements and details and more just conceptually what it conveyed or the mood it engendered. So one of the things we notice is that the Mikdash obviously was built higher up than anywhere else, right? The Mikdash, and we're going to get to this in a few more classes from now, is almost inextricably linked to the palace that Shlomo builds. In fact, it took him twice as long to build his palace as it did to build the Beit HaMikdash. No judgments, but we're gonna, right? So they're inextricably linked, which politics and theology in the ancient world, there's no such thing as separation of church and state. They are one and the same.
Adjacent.
Yes, correct. They were all part of the building project together, okay? And one of the things that you may have noticed in those first two psukim is that if you look and you actually, okay, so here the picture chose to go with one opinion that the Kodesh Kodashim was higher up. The measurements there that I quickly read through make it clear that if you were to look at the Kodesh as a box, it had larger internal measurements than the Kodesh Kodashim, right? So the question is, was the Kodesh Kodashim higher up and you had to get stairs to go up to a smaller cube? Or was it flush with the grounds of the Kodesh, but then what would have to happen? The ceiling would be lower, okay? The walls would be closer in, but most noticeably, the ceiling would be lower. The picture here chooses to make it look elevated. It's unclear which one it was. We actually have no idea. It would almost make sense. We'll see next week. You'll tell me next week which one makes sense. Okay, I'm gonna read you one pasuk here, just to give you a sense of how helpful all the ancient Near Eastern digs all the temples that we found help us with, okay? Someone translate for me Pasuk Dalet, verse 4. Vayas labayit chalonei shkufim atumim. He made in the building chalonot, which are windows. So shakuf means clear, and atum means plugged up. So is it shakuf or is it atum? That makes absolutely no sense. Huh?
Transparent and opaque.
Yeah. Well, atum is more than that. Atum is like to plug something like seal, right? Sealed. Yeah.
It's translated in Safari as lattice.
Okay, excellent. So lattice is the now dominant translation in academic circles. Why? Because if you look at your beautiful pictures here, which came out much darker than I would have liked, you have pictures here of the Ein Dara temple in Syria that I mentioned is the closest parallel to Shlomo HaMelech's Mikdash. It was built, it was contemporaneous with it. And many of the features were almost identical to Shlomo's, except, save the big footprints of the God entering, we mentioned last week. If you look there, what you see are windows. What is a lattice? What impression does a lattice create?
It's a picture, it's a pattern.
There's a pattern, so it's kind of as if there's a window there, but it's latticed, so it's both shakuf and atum, meaning there's something filling up the space, but it's also in theory functions or stylistically appears like a window. Okay, it was a pasuk that Mefarshim had no idea what to do with for literally thousands of years, and then boom, we find the Ein Dara temple, and now we're translating it as latticed. Okay, so again, that's one type of example. Now, the windows in the main area, the area of the Kodesh was probably light, and at night, how would it have been lit up? By the menorah. Okay, however, the Kodesh Kodashim had to be kept dark. Okay, and I'm going to read to you from one source here. I'll go to sources 4 and 5, and I apologize that they're out of order. I switched up the order of how I was doing things. Okay, look in sources 4 and 5. Now, what these are talking about, one of them, the composition is from the Curse of Agad, where they're talking about how they're describing what happened, why the temple there was destroyed. And look inside, there's two things, okay? The first one is describing just the temple of Enlil. It says, the house of Enlil, it is mountain great. The house of Linlil, it is mountain great. The house of darkness, it is mountain great. The houses which know no light, it is a mountain great. There's a sense that the temples themselves had to be dark inside. Now, our Kodesh was light, but the inside Kodesh Kodashim was pitch black. There were no windows, okay? And look at what's described. This is in the description in 5, okay, in source 5, of why the temple was destroyed. Look what it says. The people now saw its Selah, the house that knew no light, as if to say part of the process of destruction is that the chamber that was supposed to be dark and off limits, like we mentioned to people, light was streaming in and everyone saw it. Okay. Now, again, I don't want to say lahavdil a million times, right? Like the end of the Wizard of Oz so it's not that, right? But there's something to be said about all that thing that was meant to remain mysterious is now everyone can see it. There's something really horrifying about that for ancients. Okay. Now, what do you notice on the sides of the building? What do you notice on the sides there, like surrounding the actual Kodesh? What? Yeah, it's a frame. These are called the yitziot or the tslaot in the text itself. Right around it, you see where there's like here, like stairs, and they're probably there for 2 reasons. They probably had 2 functions. Okay, one is that if you look in Pasuk Zayin, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some sources, but if you look in Pasuk Zayin and Pasuk Vav, it makes very clear that Shlomo followed the rules that we have from the Torah, which is that anything Mikdash associated has to be of unhewn stone. You can't use metal, right? You can't use things that are used for war to chisel away at the stone, and so it was rough on the edges. So these outer yitziot and slaot probably have 2 functions. One is that the Mikdash itself was built of that rough unhewn stone, and then these were the outer sort of frames, so that from the outside the Mikdash looked beautiful, but you were still following the rules of not hewing the stone. And also, look, what do you see in the picture there?
Which part of it?
Right here, there's like a frame around the Mikdash that we never think of, and it ruins our image of this place that never had to. So, well, no, it looks like windows because it's sliced. right? This is basically, imagine a house. They do this in museums all the time. There's a building and they slice it down so you could see inside. Oh, there are windows there possibly also for light, I think. It was where it was a cross section. Thank you. There's the word I couldn't think of. It was probably to store. Don't forget, people would come and donate treasures to the temple, and kings from other countries would come and donate. There's a story in the end of Malachim Bet where Chizkiyahu shows off the temple treasures. He wasn't just giving him a tour of the Mikdash. He was a foreign king. He was giving him a tour of all of the wealth accumulated and associated with the temple. So it was stored. These were the machsans of the temple, so to speak, donations that people make to the temple. All of that was kept there. Okay. And the temple treasurers probably had to keep, right, all of those treasures organized and accounted for, which is probably also why in the second temple, it was probably less accounted for, and there was probably a lot more shady stuff going on there. Okay, go to Pasuk Tet. I'm going to read you something interesting. Vayiven et habayit vayichalehu, vayispon et habayit gevim usterot ba'arazim. Vayiven et hayitzia kol habayit. That's the yitzia we were talking about. Now, the wood that's used, not for the inner, not for the Kodesh Kodashim, but the wood that's used for majority of the temple was cedar wood. If I asked you why cedar wood, what would you tell me? A couple of obvious reasons. It smells amazing. What else? Huh? They're very tall, right? The trees of the cedar. So if you have to make a big, tall, you don't want to start combining pieces of wood. It's going to be inherently weaker. The cedars of Lebanon were known to be the tallest trees in the area. So that's certainly, again, that's what we as modern thinkers think of, and probably also part of what factored into the decision. But I'm going to read you something else interesting. Look on your source sheets. Go back to source 2. Actually, no. Source 2. Sorry. The first, best of my cedars. Reshati Eramija, okay? It's saying here, which I brought from Lebanon, the holy forest, for roofing Ekua, the temple of the God and his lordship I sought out. Okay, the cedars of Lebanon were also taken. The forests of Lebanon were believed to be holy forests. If you look back, we're not looking at Shlomo's palace now, but if you look back at Shlomo's palace, read through the description. Does anyone remember what he does in the sort of portico to his palace? He has these huge columns of cedar wood that almost mimic the feeling of walking through a cedar forest towards his palace. The forests of Lebanon were these places that were believed to be holy, where the gods dwelled. So you walk into Mikdash and everything smells like cedar wood. Again, go back to not just the geographical space, but the thematic and the mythic space. Consciously or unconsciously, it evokes certain thoughts and experiences in the human being. If you look down, I'm going to, look down at hold that source 3 for a little bit. Okay, so the roof, by the way, was also constructed. So moving a little bit further into the Mikdash, go to Pasuk Tet Zayin. Vayiven et verse 16. Vayiven et esrim amam yarketei habayit bitzaot arazim mina karka ad hakirot. Right, so they were going the beams went all the way from floor to ceiling. Vayiven lo mibayit lidvir lekodesh kodashim. The whole outer area was cedar wood. The inside, we're going to see if the kodesh kodashim was oil wood, which is a more expensive wood, and we're going to talk about why that's important. And it goes on and it describes the heichal, how the internal walls were lined with cedar wood. The floor was made of cypress, and the two side walls and the front wall had these carvings of gourds and calyxes, all these beautiful flowers, all covered in what material? It goes without saying? Gold. Everything's overlain in gold. Now, the inside Kodesh Kodashim, which we're going to spend more time talking about, but I'm mentioning this now because we're going to get back to it towards the end of class. The internal Kodesh Kodashim, all 4 of the walls were wood, covered with a different way of covering with gold. And we only know this because 2 different words are used. I'm mentioning it, you'll see why it's important in a minute. And the decorations were more ornate. So if you had sort of, you're going to have instead of calyxes, you're going to have kruvim inside. You're going to have palms. And again, there were certain images in the ancient world that were harder to create, harder to craft. Those were reserved for the Kodesh Kodashim, and the wall between the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim had the more ornate object. So it was almost like a warning. This space is more ornate. This space is set off from the Kodesh itself. Okay, and we're going to get back to the Kodesh Kodashim also. I'm also skipping over the beginning of Perek Zayin because we're going to talk about it when we talk about the connection between kingship and temple. But everyone jump down. Yeah.
The outside wall leading to the Kodesh Kodashim, not the inside wall.
Correct. If I'm standing in the Kodesh, which is, well, I can't even, but the Kohen, so he sees the design, instead of seeing just all these three walls around me, would be gourds and calyxes, which for whatever reason were considered less ornate. But on the wall to the Kodesh, I'm going to see images of the kruvim, which are sort of indicative of what lay behind. Okay, go to Pasuk Yud Gimel in Perek Zayin. And I want you to tell me, it's very, very interesting. Remember the big deal we made about Bezalel being chosen because he was inspired with Ruach Hashem and he was special and all these other, right? His resume was impeccable. Look at Pasuk Yud Gimel there, verse 13. It says, Vayishlach Melech Shlomo, Vayikach et Chiram mitzor. Where's Tzor?
Another country.
Yeah, all the way up by Lebanon, okay? Then Isha almanahu mimaten Naftali va'aviv ish tzori. So his father is not even Israelite. He's from Tyre. Choresh nechoshet. But why did Shlomo conscript him?
He's an artisan.
He's the best of the best. Okay, if we had to guess, either Hiram or maybe his dad designed the temple in Ein Dara because it was built earlier than the one of Shlomo's. ואביו איש צורי חורש נחושת, וימלא אל החכמה ואת התבונה ואת הדעת לעשות כל מלאכה בנחושת. ויבוא אל המלך שלמה ויעש את כל מלאכתו. Okay, now again, I'm mentioning this for a few reasons. One, because it's just interesting to see that Shlomo, of course, goes without saying, is going to get the best of the best of the best. But we also have to remember, this guy is living in Tyre, designing for all the kings in the area, right? So what he's going to design for us is going to be the architecture of the day and the nechoshet of the day. Okay, the Beit HaMikdash was very stylish, yeah.
The big difference, the Mishkan was planned and, as I said, Hebrew Menahel Avodah, supervised by God, with God's appointees, and it was raw, it was Kodesh. And what Shlomo HaMelech built was his design and his...
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt for 1 second, then sorry, no more, yeah.
If anything, I would say the Mishkan was part of us being isolated from the rest of the world. We should have nothing compared to the rest of the world.
So yes and no. Okay, so I'll just repeat for the Zoomers. What people here are saying is they're sort of distinguishing between the Mishkan that we imagine because we were sort of in this, I don't know what you want to call it, sort of hermetically sealed environment, right? Devoid of outside culture. And because it was Hashem chose and just told us how to design it, that in theory, it should have been different from the ancient Near East. But, okay, Dibra Torah Kilshon B'nei Adam. Just like Hashem appears in an Anan, because that's how gods were conceived, Israel was in Mitzrayim all those years. They saw temples. They knew what temples looked like. And by the way, at the time when Israel left Egypt, Egypt had control over Canaan. So there was a lot heavy Egyptian influence on the temples. So to imagine that the Mishkan was sort of this, perfect, idealized thing that had nothing to do with outside cultures, we're going to see as we go through the specifics. The Kruvim themselves had significance in the ancient world. The Aron itself had significance in the ancient world. So yes, is it different in the sense that Hashem commanded Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, and Moshe did everything Hashem said? 100% in terms of the, I would say the Mishkan being set as an ideal. Okay, but to imagine that the Israelites in the Midbar were not still product of an ancient or Eastern environment is is just imagining something, right? It's just not the case. But the reason I'm making a big deal about Hiram is to just realize that the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim was one of the most beautiful buildings in the Near East, but it was a building of the Near East. And what we're going to be spending time on, I think next class, if I remember correctly, is, well, if it just looks like an ancient Near Eastern temple, then why is it so special and holy? And that's what we're going to get to next week. But let's talk a little bit more about some of the vessels and furnishings. One of the things, if you go to Pasuk Yud Tetvav, okay, now we're going to get to some of sort of the experiences or the emotions that walking into the temple evoked. Vayatzar et shnei ha'amudim nechoshet. Okay, so he makes these two massive amudim, which are here on your pictures. Okay, you see, well, here you actually only have one and then you have the base, right? Because again, it's that cross section. You have a big column here and then an empty column where the other one would have stood. And what's interesting is that not only does he make these two beautiful, and if you read through the descriptions between Pasuk Tetvav and Chaf, one of the things we see is how ornate and how beautiful these columns themselves are. Right, so it says, for example, in Pasuk Yud verse 18, "Vayas et ha'amudim u'shnei turim saviv, et ha'sfacha ha'echat lechasot et ha'kotaret asher al rosh harimonim." There's all these plant-like images on the top of it, ve'kotarot asher al rosh, etc., etc. And jump down to Pasuk Chav Aleph. These amudim were really important. How do we know that? Because look at Pasuk Chav Aleph. "Vayakam et ha'amudim le'ulam ha'echal." Vayakam et ha'amud ha'yemani, vayikra et shemo Yachin. Vayakam et ha'amud ha'smali, vayikra shemo Boaz. Okay, how do I know these pillars are important? They're named. Okay, it's kind of bizarre, but not if we think about what these pillars probably were. Okay, think about, you look at the pillars there, what do you notice? They were immense. And there's two different opinions as to what they were. And by the way, some say that they were just freestanding, just for design. Some say they were weight bearing. We don't know which it is. Okay, but probably, okay, what it created, similar, by the way, to those footprints that we saw at Ein Dara, is the sense that you're walking in here. It almost frames the building. You're walking in. The God has already, or the God, this is the gateway through which God is going to walk. Okay, there's something perhaps about that. What else? Look at the pillars. What do they remind you of just by their design? Yeah, they look like trees. They look like, so what makes, when we think of somewhere with two trees, what do we think of? Gan Eden. Okay, go back to last class. We said the whole idea of the temple is God creates the world and the universe is God's palace, so to speak. Right? But human beings build microcosms of that control center, so to speak, on earth so that we can visit God. Okay? But if you're going to build this microcosm of God's abode, so you're going to go back to that sort of utopian garden where there are trees, where Ruach Elo, right, where God is walking, Elokim mitalech b'toch hagan, and it's going to sort of create this sense of that garden. Okay, now hold Breshit in your head because I'm bringing you to another pasuk. Go to Chaf Gimel. Vayas et hayam, and you see this on your pictures. And I think many of us probably, until we see the pictures or actually read the measurements, never imagined the yam to be this big. Okay, look at pasuk Chaf Gimel. Vayas et hayam mutzak eser ba'ama misvato ad svato. Agol saviv v'chamesh be'ama komato, v'kav shloshim ba'ama yasovoto saviv. Some even suggest that the pool was big enough for the Kohanim to dip in, that it was used as a mikvah. Okay, how it would have worked with rainfall, not clear, but meaning the size itself was big enough that that's even something people speculate about. Why? And then look at what it describes. Ufka'im mitachat lisvato saviv sovivimoto. Eser be'ama, etc., etc. It's describing, and surrounding it are these turim, are these cows. Okay, so you have animals standing at the basin. Each wagon. Now I'm going to read something which is really, really interesting. Look in verse 25. Omed al shnei asar bakar, shlosha ponim tzafona, ushlosha panim yama. Ushlosha ponim negba, Ushlosha ponim mizracha, v'hayam aleihem, milmala v'chol achoreihem baita. Okay, so what does this make you think of? What does it make you think of? The waters in all four directions. Nahar, all the in the beginning, in that creation of the world, if you remember, before there was rainfall. So it said there was Nahar Prat and Nahar, there was all the rivers coming forth from that axis mundi, that Gan Eden, that nourished the world. So here you have this basin of water, the animals symbolically pointing in all four directions on the compass. You have those big trees. And so again, perhaps even unconsciously, you're walking into that primordial garden from where God rules, okay? Now, something else, I'll read you actually something cool. Look inside. I'll read you two things, actually. Go to source 3 for a second.
I'm sorry, it's a really stupid question.
No, not at all.
Under that basin, the bakar, where are they made of? They're not.
Whatever they were made of, they would have been covered in, well, it's outside, so they would have been covered in bronze. Yeah, they're covered in bronze. Everything outside in the Chatzar was covered in bronze. Everything inside was gold, which we're going to talk about. What?
I said only the young can read it.
You see, there you go. Thanks a lot. Okay, source 3. When the second year came, I raised to heaven. This is from the Assyrian annals of Asar Hadon. Okay, I raised to heaven the head of Asara, the Lord Ashur's dwelling. Above heavenward, I raised high its head. Below in the underworld, I made firm its foundations. So again, that sense that it's reaching up to the heavens and down to the underworld. There's that connection between the gods and everything that exists below. In the Ehur Shagala, meaning house of the great mountain, I made beautiful as the heavenly writing. I piled it up like a mountain, that temple. From foundation to top, I built and completed. I filled it with luxury and astonishing to look at. Beams of cedars and cypress, produce at Mount Sirara and Mount Lebanon, whose fragrance is sweet, I spread over it. I bound up cypress door with gold bands and set them in portals, the disordered chapels, daisy stands, and drawings. I restored and improved and made bright as the sun. Its lofty high head scraped the sky. Below, its roots spread in the subterranean waters. Okay, hold this image. We're not talking about it now, but hold the image of the idea that the waters underneath are always trying to come up. We're going to see a really interesting midrash about David HaMelech, that the Torah suppresses this myth, that midrash, it's sort of, there's a lot of stories that Tanakh ignores because we don't believe in those things, that make their way into midrash anyway later on, which is cool. All the furnishings needed for Asara, I made anew and placed therein. Okay, now, here's something else which is really, really cool. There's something else which many of you that have been in my other classes know, and I mentioned it briefly last week. The creation of the world, okay, is associated in the ancient creation myths with what? The suppression of chaotic forces that manifest as water. Okay, we have the story of the flood, but in our flood, Hashem brings the water to punish mankind for evil. Okay, if you look at creation myths, look at the Babylonian creation myth. You have the god Marduk suppressing the chaotic forces of the salty water Tiamat, who's trying to bring chaos. When he suppresses it, he then builds the world from her corpse and then builds his temple in Babylon. Okay, the chaotic forces of water in many, many, many ancient creation stories is what had to happen before a god could become a god. There's actually a couple of references in Yeshayahu and Tehillim to this myth with Hashem, but there's one place in Tanakh where, again, in a monotheistic way, Hashem is able to be sort of triumphant over chaotic forces of water.
Yeah.
And then Kriyat Yam Suf is the only time in Tanakh where we say, what? The whole time, Hashem, I'm not talking about the Mishkan now, I'm talking about a temple itself, right? Hashem says, I don't need it. David says, no, I want to build it. Hashem says, do me a favor, I'm fine wandering. Listen, I'm going to read you one pasuk that appears in Shmot Perek Tetvav. Interestingly, it's one of the few times that the idea of a temple being built is mentioned in this context. Hashem defeats the gods in Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? Hashem proves Bezot Teida ki ein kamoni, Bezot Teida ki ani Hashem b'kerav haaretz. And then the climax of the process of Hashem proving that he is the strongest God in the universe is Kriyat Yam Suf, where Hashem shows ultimate control over the forces of water. They're chaotic, there's a storm, and Hashem says, no, split, and then come back together on his, right, at his will. And then look towards the end of Kriyat Yam Suf, it says as follows. I'm going to read starting Pasuk Tedvav. In Perek chapter, Perek Tedvav, Pasuk Tedvav. Az nivhalu alufei Edom elei Moav yochazei mora'ad namogu chol yoshvei Canaan tipol aleihem imatav hapachad. They're all going to be scared of God. Bigdol zroacha yidnu ka'aven, etc., etc. Tivi emo v'tita emo behar nachlatcha. Right now, we're all going to be brought to. They're asking Hashem, bring us to this har. Machon l'shiftecha pa'alta Hashem. Mikdash Hashem kunenu yadecha, Hashem nimloch leolam va'ed. Kriyat Yam Suf is the victory chant when our God proved supreme over all the other gods. And what we promise Hashem, just like all the other suppressions of the chaotic forces of water, is to build God a temple like he deserves. Okay, now hold that in your head for 1 second. And I'm going to read you something else, which also may help us understand what these animals are doing standing there, looking in all different directions. Look in source, it got cut off, source 7. The number got cut off because they added the header on the top. Let my father therefore bring my battle trophies and weapons for me. Let Enlil bathe my heroic arms. Let him pour holy water on the fierce arms which bore my weapons. Let him set up a holy dais in the throne room. Let him set my heavenly chariot upon a pedestal, which we're going to get to with the Aron. Let him tether my captured warriors like they're the budding bulls. Let him have my captors, kings, make obeisance to me as the light to heaven. What is happening in that there in that dedication of the temple? What is the king's father bringing him? What are those? What's he setting up? Trophies that are what? Spoils of war, trophies, right? Indicative of those battles that he won. Now, look back inside. What was Kriyat Yam Suf essentially all about? Hashem defeating them. And what does it keep talking about? Susvirocho Rama Bayam, right? It was the chariots of Egypt that were there. That was their, right, greatest strength. So now look back at the Kior, and if we imagine Hashem's triumph over those, again, this is all symbolic, right? But it's the metaphor. The triumph over the chaotic forces of water, and then the trophies, right? The trophies that stand sort of, and again, it's not the susim, it would be the bakar, but the image of the sort of battle, right? The trophies from battle, okay? There's one other thing that the animals could symbolize there. You have the birds, you have the cows, right? You have the turim and the cows. What else could that in theory symbolize? Okay, so excellent. Sacrifice. There's another thing, yeah. Gan Eden. Okay, excellent. Okay, so Gan Eden as that sort of utopia, right? Where all the animals, until we messed up, the snake got along with everybody, right? All the animals got along and we got along with the animals. Everyone lived in peace, which is touching on the next thing, which is looking last in your sources. Okay, and I'm going to read you another image and you'll tell me what pasuk in Tanakh this reminds you of. In Dilmun, the raven was not yet cawing, the partridge not cackling, the lion did not slay, the world was not carrying off lambs, the dog had not been taught to make kids curl up, the pig had not learned that grain was to be eaten. We're skipping over the pig because Tanakh doesn't actually have the pig in our pasuk because the pigs were gross and dirty. By the way, in archaeological evidence also, they found remains of all different bones in Israelite settlements, and there's but for the most part, very, very, very few pig bones relative to all the other domesticated animals, which is very cool. But why is that important? You mentioned Gan Eden. What is this image here? Huh? Okay, right? This utopia where all the animals can get along. The pasuk in Yeshayahu, which I will read to you right now. Yeshayahu pasuk Yud Aleph. When Yeshayahu is imagining this utopian future where everything is going to be beautiful and all the animals are going to get along and human beings are going to get along. Yeshayahu pasuk Yud Aleph, Perak Yud Aleph, pasuk Vav says as follows. Vigar ze'evim keves v'namer in gedir bats ve'egel ukfir umari yachtav v'na'ar katon noheg b'hem. Literally almost identical. Again, Yeshayahu was a poet of his day, drawing from the literary norms that surround him. So nowadays, if I want to describe utopia, I'll describe it in my language and using the idioms that are used in my world. And when Yeshayahu wants to describe utopia to the people listening to him, he's going to draw from the images of his world, which are animals lying together and enjoying and living in peace, the animal kingdom and the human kingdom. So go back, you mentioned Gan Eden, that's the perfect, right? This idea, we have the two trees, we have the waters that are now nourishing the earth, we have the animals coexisting, all on that subconscious level. You walk into this utopia where God rules the world in perfect order. He has perfect cosmic control, so to speak. And you mentioned the word awe, you are in awe because you're surrounded by all of these unconscious things that are communicating God's power and God's ruling of the world. Okay, that's what happens when you walk into the Mikdash. Okay, I have like 2 minutes remaining. I want to just mention one other thing. We don't have time really to look fully inside, but I'm going to mention it so that you could be aware of it when you also, because it was another element that actually is very, very cool that would happen. If you look at all the outer furnishings, someone said before, what were they covered in? They were all covered in bronze. Okay. If you walk inside to the Kodesh, they were all gold. Okay. To the Kodesh, it was all gold, and the Kodesh Kodashim, it goes without saying, was gold. The Kodesh, for example, used cedar wood, and the Kodesh Kodashim used oil wood, which is more expensive. And one of the things that's interesting is that as you get further into the Mikdash, and this is also, I'll show you in a second with the Mishkan, how it's lost on us. All of the materials get more intricate, like we mentioned, right? It takes more craftsmanship, and they're made from more expensive materials. Okay. Now, what that communicated is this sense of gradations of holiness, right? The lay people could be outside with the nechushet stuff. Only the Kohanim go into the gold room, right? And only the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur goes all the way further in. And so we don't have time to do it now, but all of the craftsmanship, read more carefully now. You'll see that there was different design in the Kodesh versus the Kodesh Kodashim. The way the bowl was laid was different. I'll give you one other example of this phenomenon. If you look in the way that the Mishkan is described, okay, so there's 3 different words for the way that because the Mishkan, most of it was material, right? The kelim themselves were matechet, but the building itself was fabrics. Okay, there's 3 different words that are used for how the fabrics were created. There's oreg, there's rokem, and there's choshev, which we don't pay enough attention to know that there's a difference between them. Weaving is weaving is weaving. Oreg is the most simple type of weaving of one type of fabric and one color. Okay, so the simple linen undercoat of the Kohen Hediot would be linen, simple, one material, one color. Rokem is when you start weaving different fabrics together, colors. So you'll have the red and the blue wool woven into some sort of picture or design. And a choshev is, I'm confusing it. Rokem is where you have 2 colors being mixed. And a choshev is already where you're having designs like the kruvim, okay, being woven from those different colors. So as you walk in, the materials get more expensive. The weaving becomes more intricate. And I'll give you one other thing that's, again, totally lost on us. If you look at the ratio, right? So in the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim, so it was blue and red mixed. We know that, right? There was the reds and the blues together mixed, the tchelet. But if you go further in, there's more blue than red in the ratio. Blue is listed, right? If I read ingredients on a box and my kid wants a cereal and I see the first ingredient is sugar and the second is wheat, So I'm not going to buy the cereal because sugar is the first ingredient. If you look at how the materials were woven, how much blue versus how much red, again, lost on us, but everyone in the ancient world knew that blue was the more expensive to prepare the tchela. If you think about it, by the way, I'll throw this out there so we realize how little we understand about how materials work. One of the things that happens when we speak, and this is the last thought, I'll end on this. When we speak, so we don't realize that part of grammar and syntax and any language is how we organize adjectives. Okay, so if I wanted to say an English sentence, I would say the big yellow school bus, okay, full of children. I'm not going to say the big full of children yellow school bus big, right? We don't realize it, but that's part of syntax, is how we organize adjectives. One of the things we do without realizing it is we list more expensive things first. We say gold and silver, diamond and rubies. We don't do it all the time. We may not do it on purpose, but when we're listing things, we list dollars and cents. Okay, that's how we speak. Okay, for much of the ancient world, and again, this is just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. When we talk about gold and silver, we would say gold and silver. Where's the one exception to that? You know the pasuk. What did Hashem tell Moshe? Thank you. When Bnei Yisrael were leaving Mitzrayim, Hashem said to them, told Moshe, ask them, klei kesef b'chlei zahav, silver and gold. Because Egypt in that period is one of the only places in the world where silver was more monetarily valuable than gold. Okay, tiny little things that we would not realize, but that when an ancient person is walking in and first he sees linen and then he sees wool and then he sees red wool and then he sees purple wool and then he sees, so all of that creates this sense of increasing holiness, of getting closer and closer to that place where God is. Okay, so the more we dig up, the more we can begin to imagine what the Mikdash meant. We're going to talk in the next, I think it's either next class or the one after, about what happens on the inside in that mysterious space and why that's so important. So we will get to that. I want to leave time for questions. Anyone on Zoom, unmute yourselves, and any questions in the room, please, by all means. Nothing? Oh my. Are there any Zoom questions? You can take yourselves off mute, or do I have to unmute them? Hold on. Should all be unmuted. Never unmute yourself. Unless you have no questions. All right, you can unmute yourself. Yes, please.
I'll put the phone inside the Polish for the sheet if everything is dark.
Oh, very good question. He couldn't. He was not supposed to. He only went in one day a year. We're going to get to it.
I mean, he's got to do this and he's got to do this.
He doesn't have to do that much. He just sprinkles blood everywhere. We'll see. It's meaning he's not doing avodah in it.
He's got to have the spice.
No. So the Ketorah was prepared before. We'll get to it.
Okay.
He had to walk in and let the room smoke up first. He doesn't prepare the Ketorah inside. Nothing happened inside other than the sprinkle.
Totally dark, smoky room, and he sees
Nothing. Correct.
He doesn't have to put things between.
Nothing.
Didn't he have his,
Wait, hold on. Ner Tamid was the menorah.
You could die doing it.
it wasn't like in our school?
No, I think that's reminiscent of the menorah,
Oh, okay.
if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
But didn't he wear like it was called the thing with the light?
The bells.
No, not the bell. The other thing that asked the question.
So the only thing that we'll get to, oh, the choshen, but it wasn't a flashlight.
It didn't have.
We're going to spend a class on guys, we're going to spend a class on the choshen. What was it? Like this magical thing that lit up with answers? That's like a weird thing to imagine Judaism believing in. We're going to get to it. What? It was a Ouija board, exactly. Well, you'll see, even Ezra has an even more interesting take on what it was. All right. Have a great day, guys.
Thank you.
And an early Shabbat Shalom. I love finishing on Wednesday. I just say good jobs to everybody.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Yes, sorry. I'll put my yes. You know what? I just want everyone to feel comfortable. Yeah. Oh.
Wait a